What do we talk about when we talk about trauma? For me, it's interesting that every time we experience a trauma, nevertheless, after the experience of this trauma, we have, in general, an idea, a representation, a theory, a knowledge of trauma. And for me, it's very important to clarify or to find the definition, the history of this term, the term trauma, the theory of trauma. Usually, we remember the legacy of Freudian psychoanalysis, for instance. And Freudian defined the trauma as a sort of primordial instinct, as a sort of drive of our psyche that goes back to a sort of inorganic unconscious, where actually the only thing that the mind is doing there is like repeating the experience of trauma, almost in an inorganic way. The story I want to try to remember today, the genealogy of trauma, is a different one. I try to, with you, to remember another genealogy of this idea that is not the Freudian one. Because in the 20th century, there were many schools of psychoanalysis or psychology of neurology, and different notions of trauma were developed. And these are histories of the notion of trauma that also influence later cybernetics, and interestingly, also the evolution of artificial intelligence. So it's a sort of nucleus, a sort of core that somehow we can relate to the origin of the digital culture and the digital matrix. So in the early 20th century, there were neurologists like von Monachov and Kurt Goldstein. They were working between Switzerland and Germany. And von Monachov first, but then also Kurt Goldstein later, develop one of the first model of neuroplasticity. Today, neuroplasticity is quite a fashionable term, but has been was actually already indeed studied and theorized in the early 20th century, actually in a very sophisticated way. Neuroplasticity, in the best definition, in the most articulated definition for me, is the capacity of our brain to recover after an accident, to reorganize itself, indeed, after a trauma. Von Monachov called this capacity of our neural networks to reorganize themselves and actually to move also cognitive faculties in different new parts of the brain, diaskesis. He used this Greek term that today we could translate with neuroplasticity. Von Monachov described in patients that had brain injuries, the capacity of the brain, for instance, to delocalize the faculty of language from one area to the other. It was an idea of distributed memory, distributed cognition. That was not common all the time. Even today, we'll say that some neuroscientists have a very, they have the tendency to go back to a localized model of the mind, of the brain. After von Monachov, we should remember Kurt Goldstein, that was a neurologist active in Berlin and in Frankfurt in the 1920s and 1930s, and that had to then to migrate to the United States, to New York, when Nazi took power in 1933. Kurt Goldstein wrote a very influential book called, translated later on as The Organism. And in this book, like von Monachov, he described, indeed, the human brain has a sort of holistic entity, as using a lot of organismic metaphor to describe basically a mind that was able to self-organize, but more specifically, and interesting for us, to self-organize to survive to trauma. Goldstein was not a pure theoretician, was a neurologist actually treating soldiers coming back from the front line of World War I. There were soldiers with very heavy brain injuries. That had very severe issue, for instance, of memory loss, but also loss of linguistic faculties. And Goldstein, nevertheless, in some of these soldiers, managed to record an incredible capacity, or at least a small capacity to recover cognitive function. And Goldstein then developed, on this basis of these findings, a very sophisticated idea of the mind, of the brain and neurology, in the sense that he made this theory that our brain actually in everyday life is able to actually learn because it produces small catastrophic reaction. Basically, our brain, its neural networks every day to learn from the environment, but also to progress in the learning, produce small catastrophic reaction. And the whole economy then of the brain becomes this indeed organism that is actually familiar with the form, with the structure of trauma. So I find it very fascinating and very interesting, this idea of small traumas that our brain every day basically self-organize in order to adapt to the environment, and maybe in order to be prepared to bigger traumas that our experience has to encounter. And I have to mention Goldstein for other important reason, because the name Kurt Goldstein may sound esoteric to many of you, but his book, The Organism, published in 1934 in German, actually in the Netherlands when he was in exile, had an incredible influence on the whole French philosophy. If you think that, for instance, a famous philosopher like Michel Foucault wrote his first book as a critique of Kurt Goldstein. And we see the influence of Kurt Goldstein clearly on Georges Canguilhem, that was a mentor of Foucault, and on a good part of the history of medicine that was developed in France after World War II. Goldstein had incredible influence also on Merleau-Ponty and his phenomenology, but interestingly enough, also on the history of cybernetics. If we take a book like Wiener Cybernetics, that's considered the Bible of cybernetics, published in 1948, we find a chapter on the psychopathologies of machine. And cyberneticians that were a bit controversial figure, in my opinion, because they were like engineers. They wanted to describe the world as a machine. Politically, they were pretty conservative and pretty questionable in their attitude. But they took a lot of inspiration from the neurology of the time and from models of neuroplasticity, from Monakov, from Goldstein, and also from the American neurologist Lashley. But there were only these three models of neuroplasticity at the time. And when the cyberneticians, they were talking about psychopathology as machine, they were referring to these models coming from neurology. And indeed, they wanted to imitate in machine the capacity of the brain basically to organize and survive to trauma. So it's very interesting that at the core of cybernetics, also of the first experiment of artificial intelligence, of the idea of distributed memory in artificial neural networks, you find this model of distributed memory, neuroplasticity, capacity of self-organization and survival to survive to trauma that were coming from the neurology of the time, from the German-speaking neurology. This is so a nucleus of the development of the philosophy and the technology, both trajectory of the 20th century, that for me is very interesting. And it's a story good to remember because we forgot it. Because today when we talk about trauma in the age of artificial intelligence, or we talk about the trauma that this overexposure or overuse of digital technologies producing in our life, somehow we forget also this important histories of the notion, and maybe we approach the problem. I think this is an important tradition also of philosophy, of thinking to remember, because indeed has a very proactive idea of the human mind and, so to speak, a proactive agenda also to face trauma. And it's important, as in any treatment of trauma that probably we know, that indeed the first important thing is the fact that we should never victimize the subject. We should never construct the subject of a trauma as a victim. We should be always able to indeed envision the subject as an active subject, even in the experience of trauma. This is, of course, difficult. When we talk about the psychopathology of capitalism in a broader sense, my thought always go to Fanon and to his studies on the psychopathology of colonialism back at this time in Algeria. I think that indeed this notion of trauma cannot be today distinguished from the condition of the economy, of the capitalism, of the digital capitalism we are enmeshed today. And this is interesting, just as a maybe final note, to remember that we cannot abandon the sophisticated idea of trauma just to leave it as a sort of inspiration that then was very fertile and prolific in the tradition of cybernetics and artificial intelligence. If you look at the history of recent artificial intelligence, you find paper by one of these important one of the godfather of deep learning, that is Hinton, that brings the title optimal brain damage. And if you take just this expression, optimal brain damage, apply to machine, use only to machine, you understand that something went through the wrong pipe, probably. And I think we have to then reclaim somehow this tradition and rebring this tradition within a more sophisticated understanding today of digital capitalism, also called cognitive capitalism. So my proposal simply for this debate, it is to go back once again to the work of Kurt Goldstein, among others, that brought within neurology, within psychology, a sophisticated notion of neuroplasticity. And to this idea that, yeah, we have to get familiar with a mind, ours, that probably every day is unconsciously organizing small catastrophic reaction to survive, to face the small and big trauma of the present.